Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week is something of an expose regarding hydroxychloroquine and wrongful death lawsuits. The World Health Organization has come under fire yet again for its, endorsement of pseudoscientific medicines. A world first, womb transplant in the UK and the ethical furor associated with it. The European Patent Office has decided that gene-edited plants can be patented. The preschool having to withdraw books showing men in leather fetish clothing. And Fukushima's water is going to be released into the ocean starting this week. This has not been a popular decision. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the stupidity that is hydroxychloroquine and people deciding to use it as a treatment for something other than parasitic worms. The whole premise of this is threefold. First, we have the wrongful death of an individual, which is terrible, but this is something that can happen. Second is that a doctor working with the anti-vaccine group, America's Frontline Doctors, prescribed it off-label to this individual. And third, the actual information itself is only available since somebody appears to have hacked into the records and made them available to everybody else. Yeah, this has multiple layers to it, and hopefully we can cut through most of the crap and give some clarity. The first issues we have are that COVID-19 was prevalent at the time this happened, so we're not talking about anything that should have been a surprise. The issue is that the individual who died had no symptoms. None. And this is why prescribing hydroxychloroquine, even if there was some sort of hypothetical, magical, far-off possibility it worked, was not appropriate. That's an issue. The fact that they then died means that the doctor themselves acted improperly and wasn't basing their treatment on evidence. In fact, the death certificate reads, "Sudden death in the setting of therapeutic use of hydroxychloroquine." And this is not going to be a surprise to most people. Using medication for something it's not meant to be used for, and worse yet, for something that doesn't even exist with that patient, is going to cause side effects, and in some cases, those side effects can be damaging, and for the 50-year-old male in question, deadly. Of course, no doctor is going to readily admit that what they've done has led to the death of an individual. This is where the hacking comes into play. The whole reason we know as much as we do is that a hacker anonymously provided this information, and they basically point out that America's Frontline Doctors have a list of physicians who have been prescribing things like hydroxychloroquine and other disproven medications that have no benefit for COVID-19. This is particularly important as America's Frontline Doctors have described themselves, or the organization, as a civil liberties organization with a purpose of providing Americans with independent information regarding healthcare from the top experts in medicine and law. It is not a medical organization that consults with patients, provides diagnoses, or prescribes treatment. Yeah, that's bullshit now, and very clearly so, given that not only do they have the records to show that they're knowingly lying, but they're doing exactly the opposite. In further news developing the COVID-19 landscape, and particularly the knowledge we have that's effective, the relationship between low vitamin D levels and the immunological response to COVID-19. Vitamin D levels have been a repeated topic, let's say, in that there has been continuous evidence showing a relationship, just not very clearly what the relationship is in all cases. Perhaps the best example is the Eastern European study looking at hundreds of thousands of results that showed that, yes, low vitamin D did increase the risk of infection. This contrasts starkly with something like hydroxychloroquine, where repeated trials have failed to show results. This means that vitamin D can be evidence-based in some kind of treatment at least, or it might be more accurate to say there is a justifiable argument that it is evidence-based compared to just about everything else. The results are, let's say, broad and not necessarily the most substantial. This is because the study, let's call it, was relatively small and entirely retrospective. It involved just under 120 individual healthcare workers. They had an average age of 53, and they shouldn't have had a history of COVID-19. They measured the amount of vitamin D within their body. They also measured immunological responses before they gave the first dose of the vaccine, when they gave the second dose of the vaccine, and then 1, 5, and 9 months after the second dose. This gives you some idea as to the not just short-term impact of vitamin D, but the much longer-term impact. Those who didn't have enough vitamin D had a not significant trend towards lower antibody levels. If you had better vitamin D levels, there was more antibodies being generated. This leads the researchers to claim that there is a relationship, or more accurate to say correlation, between vitamin D in your body and COVID-19 antibodies, but specifically at 5 months, which is a interesting specification there. This research reads in a way very much like research into vitamin C. That is, those who are deficient in intake of vitamin C will benefit from supplementing it, while those who are not deficient will see no particular benefit. Going back to, let's say, medicine of a kind, and the lack of evidence for that medicine of a kind, the World Health Organization recently endorsed and encouraged the use of things like traditional remedies. Traditional remedies, another way of saying bullshit touted by people who want to sell you something that'll do nothing for you but cost a lot of money. Most of it is pseudoscientific woo and nonsense, and why a organization called the World Health Organization is encouraging this is, well, frankly mind-boggling, and it is why they have been rightly criticized for it. The bulk of this is not based on a, let's say, official stance by the World Health Organization. It was communicated through official channels, that weirdly being Twitter, but it's not arguably the official stance of the World Health Organization because it's not done through things like official communications in the form of a publication, report, announcement, or similar. But it is by the World Health Organization, so it's one of those things where they can try and fudge the legitimacy of the criticisms, but you really shouldn't have done this in the first place. As you can imagine, this is Twitter, and on Twitter everything is free game, but especially if you are a health organization that is spreading not health information, in fact, quite often the exact opposite. This leads to criticism across the board, but the big one is, just because something has been used traditionally doesn't mean it is effective, and in some cases even safe. This led to the World Health Organization backpedaling within a few days, adding a small addendum to it with another tweet which read, "It claims to aim to build a solid evidence base for policies and standards on traditional medicine practices and products. That those who are going to follow this advice should ensure they have proper safety checks, such as speaking with health practitioners before starting a new protocol. The health practitioner should just tell you, don't do it, and that would be the best advice, which means the very advice to talk to them is a waste of their time and yours." As we've previously shown, things like homeopathy and naturopathy are just bunk. You can't dilute something to the levels that are used most commonly in either of those practices and have any of the actual ingredient left behind. It's not even any of the active ingredient, it's just not there at all. And that's a problem. The World Health Organization is quite literally promoting the sale of water marketed as some sort of medicine. Given the recent screw-ups that are the aspartame and glyphosate reports by IARC, The World Health Organization is gradually losing some of its not only prestige, but public support by those who would otherwise have most strongly supported it: scientists, health practitioners, and, to a certain extent, the wider community. Next we have a medical development with regards to lung cancer, COVID-19, and effectively complaints about how it was handled in a hospital. The article is useful and interesting, not so much to, let's say, understand the exact complaint, but to demonstrate the problems in how you implement masking in hospitals. In this case, the Ottawa Hospital has two different standards. For those who are in what are effectively public areas, there's no requirement for anyone to mask. This means that patients and visitors can see each other and see each other's face, importantly. But within the ward itself, that is where patient treatment will occur, or patients are, they are required to mask. But that's not what happened, and for this individual, it's especially important. They have three things that make them especially vulnerable to COVID-19. The first is that they had lung cancer, which is already going to make them more vulnerable to infection. The second is that they're being treated for this, and the radiation is going to play merry hell with their immune system. And third, they had developed pneumonia because of that. This led to them becoming infected eventually. The reason they became infected is that people entering the ward weren't wearing masks, and the hospital says that this is not what should be happening. And this is the challenge with a masking requirement in hospitals, particularly when you have two different standards. One for one area, mostly public areas, and the other for patient-focused areas. In other medical news, we have the womb transplant that occurred in the UK this past week. The 34-year-old woman was born without a uterus or womb, and the donor, strangely enough, was her elder sister. The older sister gave the hand-me-down of a kind to her younger sister after already having children of her own. From a transplant point of view, this is perhaps the best possible candidate and recipient given how closely matched they are at a genetic level. And the whole procedure was funded by Womb Transplant UK, a charity that's trying to find ways to help with treating infertility. This is alongside things like IVF and surrogacy, but direct donations, let's say, are a potential avenue, although there are a lot of ethical issues that this is also generating as a result. It is worth saying that unlike other organ donations, this is somewhat more intimate. Not intimate as in it's an organ from within you, but rather, for some individuals, this is something that helps to identify themselves, particularly speaking to females, who can feel considerably different after having the uterus removed. It also leads to lifelong changes for the recipient, who's generally required to take immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of their life in order to avoid the transplant being rejected. The issues around this, and particularly the ethical issues, are many-fold, but some of the most significant are going to be that both donor and recipient are living at the time, whereas most other organ donations are done by somebody who's deceased to someone who is living. The next is the issues to do with, well, cost, to be blunt. In the UK, this instance was funded by a charity, but it's still £25,000, which is getting somewhere up to 40 if not 50,000 American dollars. And that's also not counting the fact that a large portion of this was covered by the health service in the UK. There are also concerns that after a certain period of time, generally after pregnancy is carried through, that the uterus itself is then surgically removed. This means that the individual undergoes at least two different surgeries, one to put the uterus in and one to take it out. Both have significant recovery times, the first involving long-term drugs afterwards, and then there are complications that go with such invasive surgeries. There's also postulation that this could lead to an organ black market, if it ever becomes somewhat mainstream. Could also completely mitigate this issue by using the artificial worms that were in development not that long ago. There's evidence from a trial showing that if you are infected with hookworms, you may have a lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Yeah, parasitic worms don't exactly sound like a fun time, let alone having that experience, let's say, in an effort to avoid something that is otherwise largely avoidable through diet and exercise. The clinical trial was being conducted in Australia at the James Cook University, and they were trying to understand if the hookworm larvae might improve metabolic health. With that in mind, just remember this was a very small study, so 24 participants, and they all had heightened levels of insulin resistance at the start of the trial. By the end, they found that those who had been infected with hookworms had a reduction in insulin resistance. So yeah, there's evidence for this, but it's also a tiny study, so you can't rely on it, and particularly if we don't know why this is happening. The conclusion by the researchers that their trial provides a proof of principle that hookworm treatment may stabilize or improve key determinants of metabolic health, such as insulin resistance, isn't really substantiated. It shows that it might be happening, but this is not a good method. Infecting people with parasites, and especially on such a small scale, doesn't necessarily show what they think it shows. Yes, it is true that they could be right, but it would be far better, if not outright better, to figure out what the hookworm is doing to improve metabolic health. For example, we don't infect people with rabies to try and cure them of cancer. We instead figured out what was going on with the immune system when you were infected with rabies, and this means we had a better treatment without the complications. The other noteworthy phenomenon with this is that there really isn't a significant dose response to the hookworm larvae that they were infected with. This would indicate that it's not necessarily the infection itself, but something that's going on during the infection that causes the improvement in health outcomes. The sample size really doesn't make that clear either, and so it's kind of difficult for them to conclude what they have the way they have. In conclusions that are slightly more useful, Europe's patent office has decided that yes, genetically modified plants can be patented. Now this is going to be interesting to see if there's a divergence in, say, European rulings on this versus other parts of the world. While it is true that you can patent your seeds, for instance, and this is something Monsanto is accused of regularly, it's not necessarily the gene editing itself that is patented. That is, which genes have been put into that particular cultivar or seed that is patented itself. And that's what the European Court is looking to approve. That is, if you have a wheat variety and you add a particular gene to make it drought resistant, you can patent that additional gene in that particular plant. And they argue that this is possible because you have created a inventive step, or used an inventive step. Importantly, this has not patented the end plant after it's grown. It is solely protecting the change of the particular gene in that particular plant using genetic modification technology. There is a, let's say, darker side to this, in that genetically modified plants are largely automatically submitted for patent applications, whereas those grown conventionally and things like crossbreeding, radiation, and so on are not able to be patented because they are, for lack of a better way of phrasing this, a natural phenomena. There's no inventive step involved, and that may be controversial. In other news, we have a publication from the Genetic Literacy Project talking about Greenpeace and how they have gradually fallen into the world of crazy and denied basic science. Greenpeace is perhaps better known for their sailing on the high seas and causing trouble for whaling, their strong and very vociferous denials of the benefits of golden rice for developing countries, and destruction of, a variety of fields where novel varieties and cultivars of plants are being grown. Yeah. Originally, Greenpeace was a much more laudable organization. They wanted to ensure that the world was able to support all of its diversity. This included plants, humans, and any other animal you could think of. In fact, even insects, fish, whatever. It was all the same to them. They wanted the world to be a better place for everything. Unfortunately, Greenpeace has gradually shifted more and more away from the ability to achieve that end goal, and instead is simply trying to stop anything that would make it happen. That is, they've become a political organization rather than an environmental organization. Arguably, golden rice is the best example of this. Currently, the land used for farming rice could just be growing golden rice instead of the generic rice that is there. This wouldn't affect anything else except for the health of humans, as they wouldn't be using new land, they wouldn't be having to make any significant changes, it would just be the rice crop that was harvested in the end. The benefits of this would be that children in developing nations would be able to see, or have a better chance of being able to see, since vitamin A was necessary for eyesight development. Greenpeace being against this runs completely contrary to their original goal to ensure the ability of the Earth to nurture life. In fact, since 1999, Greenpeace has openly and publicly admitted that they want any genetically engineered or genetically modified food completely eradicated from the food supply and environment. Yeah. The issue here is that genetically modified or engineered foods, whether that is animals or crops, would be able to reduce the human footprint and therefore effect on the environment to a huge margin. If rather than having to plant out 10 acres, 10 miles, or whatever of corn, wheat, barley, rice, or anything else, and instead you could only plant 5 and get the same result, more people can be fed, less land is needed for farming, and you can get more land given back to nature. Yet that's not what Greenpeace wants. This means Greenpeace's activities not only harm humans, but also the environment by preventing humanity from reducing the impact it has on the environment, and thereby letting the environment do what it will. Nature can survive on its own if left alone. The activities of Greenpeace go well beyond just actively working against their own goals. Instead, they actively go out of their way to not just break into and vandalize, but outright destroy fields that are being used to develop these new crops. The crops that would then be used to benefit humanity and the environment. This comes at significant cost to those who are trying to develop the modified crops. That's loss of money, development, time, and opportunity. Going from news that demonstrates that people are just illiterate to issues around literacy and specifically books. For some bizarre reason, a preschool had a book showing a man in leather fetish gear. Why this was considered appropriate for a preschool is mind-boggling, but it was previously. It has now been withdrawn. Why it took effort to get this withdrawn, and more importantly, why in the hell it was approved in the first place, is confusing. The book was called Grandad's Pride, and the cover had a leather fetish gear dressed male on it. The book was also marked as suitable for ages 4+. Given that most similar such images are considered only appropriate for the age of majority onwards, which depending on where you are could be anywhere between 16 and 20-ish, no. There is something of a spectrum in what isn't appropriate for children and, for that matter, anything in general. In this case, there is a relatively clear-cut legal threshold for which these images are considered appropriate. Now, there is an argument to be made that children younger than the age of majority, whether that is under 16 or thereabouts, or older, will access this themselves is a separate issue, and it's very much similar to the argument around how easy it is to bypass age checks on pornography websites. But having it at this age, in this situation, just seems wrong. The response to it first was relatively, let's say, ridiculous. That is, the father raising these concerns were accused of, well, being bigoted, homophobic, and so on. Compare this with things like the editing and, to a certain extent, censoring of Roald Dahl's books, and you can understand why it is that it's just bizarre. Next we have far less bizarre news, and certainly far more universally embraced and celebrated. India has become the 4th country to land on the moon, and first in the South Pole. India has over the last few years made a huge effort, and arguably gone in leaps and bounds, towards their space race efforts. India is now one of only 4 countries to get to the moon. What was the Soviet Union, United States, China, and themselves now. Their location is interesting in that they've chosen the South Pole, an area that's pretty much not been explored by anyone else. And in a way, this is useful. It'll give us more information on the lunar surface and what the moon is like. The reason this is celebrated as much as it is that the last attempt by India ended spectacularly, but for the wrong reasons. Their Chandrayaan-2 crashed into the moon's southern pole. At the same time as India successfully landed on the moon this week, Russia's attempt with their Luna 25 failed, as it did crash onto the moon's surface. The final news we have this week is about Fukushima's wastewater and the final step, let's say, as the Fukushima plant begins to slowly release the water into the ocean. Fukushima is the nuclear power plant that, well, failed somewhat. It caused a relatively minor radiation leak. The decision to start releasing the water on Thursday is one way that they have to gradually but surely allow the plant to be shut down, repaired, and gradually brought back online, although it's going to take a very long time. They're going to be releasing about 100,000 litres, which is a bit over 26,000 gallons of contaminated water. The reason they need to do this is that the water that was used for cooling is going to eventually escape anyway, and this way they can do it in a controlled manner. By doing it in a controlled manner, they also make up for the fact that there's groundwater and rain seeping into the collection site, so it's only going to keep adding more water to this if they don't get rid of it somehow. The decision hasn't been made lightly, and it's only in 2021, after several years of discussion, they decided to do this, but the way they're doing it has removed the vast majority of radioactive elements. The only thing left in there is tritium, and this is well below national safety standards. The amount of radiation being released into the oceans is minuscule, and arguably far less than you would have from other sources. It's the volume that is a question here. At least, in an arguable fortuitous turn, we know that the amount of tritium being released is very small and well below thresholds, although admittedly, in a throwback to one of the earlier articles from this week, that's a threshold set by the World Health Organization, who is not necessarily seen in the most favourable light at the moment. This, however, is supported by the fact that there is very little evidence that the amounts of tritium being released would pose any danger, and it is being monitored by the UN's atomic agency called the International Atomic Energy Agency. Of course, not everybody's happy with this, and yet another throwback to earlier this week, Greenpeace is one of the most vociferous complainers about what's happening, arguing that things like the filter technology is not adequate. Although, no doubt, Greenpeace wouldn't be happy with any filter technology, even if it only let out pure water. Politically, it's also been something of a hot potato. China is not happy either, and they've both barred fish being imported from certain parts of Japan, but also that all fish and other foods imported from Japan are tested for radioactivity. It's likely that sometime over the next roughly 40 years that this is going to take to be finalized, we'll know what's happening. So it's unlikely that this will suddenly turn the ocean radioactive over the course of a day, a week, or even a month, and there'll be plenty of warning and plenty of time to act and mitigate any damage that is happening. We're not going to get the strange three-eyed fish from The Simpsons. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.